Hi, my name is Rachel Moore, and I'm 31 years old. I served in the U.S. Army for 8 years as a logistics specialist. I've crossed borders, watched sunrises from war zones, and breathed through fire. But nothing prepared me for the silence that greeted me when I came back home. Not the kind of silence that soothes, but the kind that hums beneath the surface like a warning. I returned to Ashton, Virginia, in late October. The cab dropped me off at the foot of the driveway, same cracked pavement, same uneven mailbox leaning to the left like it always had. As I stepped out, the gravel crunched under my boots. The porch lights glowed with a dim yellow hue, casting long shadows across the steps like they were watching me, waiting to see if I still belonged. Everything looked exactly as I left it. The perfectly trimmed hedges. That ridiculous garden gnome still grinning from the flower bed. The faded windshield made from old silver spoons my dad used to say brought good luck. But it didn't feel like home anymore. Something was different. It wasn't the structure. It was the air. It didn't recognize me. It didn't carry my name. I paused at the door, key in hand. My fingers hesitated. The key slid into the lock effortlessly, like muscle memory. The door opened with a familiar click. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew whatever warmth had once lived in that house had long since vanished. There was no scent of cinnamon rolls. No old dog barking at the sound of my boots. No voice shouting from the kitchen telling me to wipe my feet. Just silence. And a faint mechanical hum I didn't recognize. A neat row of shoes lined the hallway. None of them were mine. On the coat rack, a lavender puffer jacket and 2 yoga mats leaned casually against the wall. My boots suddenly felt heavier than they were a moment ago, like they didn't belong there, like I didn't. I heard clinking glasses and polite laughter drifting from the back of the house. I followed the voices like a stranger attending her own memorial. My mother. No, Karen was the name I used now, stood in the kitchen arranging hors d'oeuvres on a slate platter. She was dressed, as always, in her preferred shades of gray. When she saw me, she didn't smile. She didn't run to hug me. She looked up and then down, like she'd noticed something stuck to the floor. "Rachel," she said, flat and clinical. "You came." "I got your text," I said, adjusting the strap on my duffel bag. "You said I should be here for Dad's anniversary." She wiped her hands on a towel, avoiding eye contact. "Yes, well, things have been hectic. Brian handled most of the arrangements." Just then, I heard him, my brother Brian, his voice booming like a stage actor's as he walked in from the dining room. "Look who's finally back," he announced, arms spread wide like he was introducing a celebrity guest. "The Wanderer returns." He hugged me quickly, a whiff of fake cologne and mint gum lingering. His smile was wide, white, and hollow. "It's not retirement," I said, keeping my voice calm. "It was an honorable discharge." Right, he chuckled dismissively. "Technicalities." He turned toward the guests in the dining room. "Everyone, this is Rachel. You know, my sister. The mysterious one who disappeared." A few heads turned. Some polite murmurs followed. "Welcome back and good to see you." But no one met my eyes. I recognized a few faces, neighbors, distant relatives, but they looked at me like I was a portrait from the attic. Familiar, but no longer useful. I didn't want to stand in that hallway any longer. I needed air, or grounding, or something real. I walked down the hall, past the pictures still hanging on the wall. Except they weren't the same. I noticed the missing ones. Photos that used to include me, replaced or recropped, like I was being edited out. I reached the door to what used to be my room. I opened it slowly. The walls were sage green. My posters were gone. The twin bed was replaced with a rolled mat and wicker baskets. A diffuser puffed lavender mist into the air. A yoga studio. They had turned my room into a yoga studio. I let out a bitter laugh before I could stop it. All those years, I kept that room intact in my memory. That space where I wrote college essays. Where I cried after receiving my deployment orders. Where I stared at the ceiling and wondered if I'd ever belong anywhere. And now it smelled like fake calm and eucalyptus oil. "She needed the space," Karen said behind me. Her arms were crossed. Her voice was sharp but devoid of emotion. We assumed you wouldn't be staying long. I didn't assume anything, I said under my breath. I just came home. She held out a pillow and a folded blanket. You can sleep in the guest room. The one by the garage. Of course. The room with no windows. The one where sound didn't travel. No hug. No conversation about the last 10 years. Just linen and dismissal. Dinner that night was muted. Brian played host, gliding from group to group with his charming act. Karen stood in the corner, always near but never engaged. I sat at the far end of the table, quiet, watching conversations I was never invited into. When the plates were cleared and glasses refilled, Brian lifted his wine glass like a toastmaster. To the ones who stayed, he said, voice theatrical, and kept this house alive. Cheers. Applause. Clinking glasses. I didn't raise mine. Once, I would have thrown a verbal dagger across the table. But I'd learned patience. I studied their faces, calculated their smiles. I didn't need to lash out. I just needed to understand the battlefield. Brian leaned closer and smirked. You're lucky we didn't sell this place, he said softly. Imagine where you'd be. They spoke about me in past tense. Like I was a ghost at my own table. I stood up quietly and stepped away from the dining room, moving toward the hallway. I passed the old cabinet beneath the living room window. It was dusty now, mostly forgotten, partially hidden by a dying potted fern. But I remembered it. I remembered everything. And I was just getting started. Later that night, after most of the voices had faded and the house returned to its uneasy quiet, I found myself standing again in the hallway, my thoughts heavier than my boots. The old cabinet under the window still sat half-hidden behind a dusty potted fern, exactly where it had always been. My father used to keep important things there, things that mattered more than anyone realized. I knelt in front of it, not because I needed nostalgia, but because I remembered the lock, the way it clicked open if you had the right angle, and a paperclip. I found one in the drawer nearby and bent it with familiar fingers. On the third try it gave. The door creaked open like a long-held breath. Behind old envelopes and fading folders was what I had hoped was still there, the property deed. And there it was, my name, bold and untouched. Rachel Marie Moore. They had erased my room, removed me from photos, and spoken of me like I was gone, but the ink on that paper didn't lie. I tucked it back carefully and stood, not with relief, but with resolve. Earlier that evening, I'd found the family photo album in the TV stand. I opened it with trembling fingers, hoping for something that proved I once belonged here. But most of the pages had been gutted, photos missing, or carefully cropped to the point of erasure. In the one military photo that remained, I had been flipped backward in the sleeve. I didn't turn it around. I didn't need to. That was when I heard her. Karen's voice came soft from behind me. Looking for something? She asked. I turned slowly. Just reminding myself I exist, I said. She didn't argue, just stared at me with that same guarded, unreadable expression. As she walked away, she murmured to herself, You always did make things complicated. The words settled into my chest like dust. No one said that about Brian. Brian was the easy one, the charming one, the one who stayed. As I passed through the dining room again, one of his friends, a woman I didn't even know by name, brushed past me, pausing just long enough to offer a faux sweet whisper. I heard Brian supported your mom all alone for years. Bless his heart. I didn't answer. There was no point. Words were useless in a house where the truth had been rewritten. Instead, I went back to the cabinet, opened it again, and stared at the deed. My name, my truth, my right. They called me a freeloader in a house I paid for with war money. But the paper in that cabinet said otherwise, and I was done letting them pretend I didn't exist. The next morning, the house felt strangely still, like it was holding its breath. I sat outside on the back porch with a mug of coffee in my hands, wearing my dad's old army jacket, the same one I used to sneak from the coat closet as a kid. The cold bit through the fabric, but I didn't mind. The oak tree in the backyard still stood tall, its limbs bare now, stretching over the fence like a protective canopy. Dad used to say the tree was the guardian of the house. But after everything I'd seen since walking through that front door, it didn't seem to be doing much guarding anymore. Inside, I could hear muffled voices, laughter, clinking glasses, more of Brian's showboating and Karen's quiet avoidance. I stood there, still as stone, letting the breeze carry snippets of conversations to me. Things like, Brian kept everything together, or, what would they have done without him? The same stories, over and over again. The stories where I didn't exist. When I stepped back inside, it was like entering someone else's carefully staged theater. The house was spotless, photo-ready. The dining table had already been reset. Crystal glasses, lined up with surgical precision. Polished silver. Judith's, no, Karen's, antique china that only came out for guests who mattered. Brian floated from room to room like he owned the air, greeting people with fake warmth and louder-than-necessary laughs. I stood at the edge of it all, unnoticed, letting myself disappear into the wallpaper. They didn't ask about me, not really. Not about my time overseas. Not about what it took to come back. They talked around me, through me, like I was part of the furniture. Nostalgic, sure, but ultimately unnecessary. Eventually, I found myself standing at the edge of the living room, arms folded, listening to a conversation I wasn't invited into. I watched Brian entertaining a group by the fireplace. Some family friends. Mrs. Reyes from church. Mr. Hall, Dad's old neighbor. People who used to ask about me. Now they couldn't even look me in the eye. She's here for the memorial, I suppose, Mrs. Reyes said, smoothing the front of her blouse like she was preparing to deliver bad news. Of course, Brian replied, his voice dipped in syrup. She needed a change of scenery. You know how the VA is so rigid. They almost didn't let her leave. We're just grateful she's stable now. Stable. That word hit harder than any insult could. Like I was a broken appliance that finally stopped sparking. I took a sip of my now lukewarm coffee and kept my face unreadable. They weren't just dismissing me, they were rebranding me, turning my entire life into a tragic anecdote. Oh, the military, Mr. Hall chimed in, his voice cracking like old vinyl. Hard to come back from that and do normal things again. Brian nodded solemnly. Thankfully, she has her pension. Not much, but it helps. That was it. Years of service, sacrifice, honor, and they reduced it to a monthly check. I glanced at Karen. She was sitting in her favorite corner chair, the one with the crochet doily draped across the back. She didn't say anything. She didn't correct them. Her hands trembled slightly as she stirred her tea, eyes low. She wasn't just silent. She was complicit. She had issues, didn't she? Mrs. Reyes whispered, almost like a confession. I remember you mentioned something during Christmas. Brian gave a thoughtful tilt of his head. Well, it wasn't easy for her. The service changes people. There were some delays, paperwork issues. Every sentence he said carved into me a little deeper. Lies served with a smile, delivered so confidently that even I wondered if they believed them. I guess it was easier to explain things away when the truth was too inconvenient. People prefer tragedy when it's neatly wrapped in ribbons. I stepped out onto the back porch again, needing air. Real air. The cold wind stung my cheeks, but at least it was honest. I looked up at the oak tree again. Its branches rustled above me, whispering secrets. Inside the house, another round of laughter burst. More talk about how Brian had held everything together. How much he'd sacrificed. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I'd learned to breathe through fire. I stayed out there a while, just listening to their voices bleeding through the glass, letting their words become background noise. Their version of reality was so curated, so perfectly polished. But the truth? That was mine. And it was patient. That night, when the guests thinned out and the house settled into its creaks and nighttime sighs, I wandered into the living room again. Not because I wanted to remember, but because I needed to reclaim something. Something that had been taken. I made my way to the old cabinet again. The one I'd opened the night before. This time, I pulled out the deed and placed it on the coffee table in front of me. Then I opened the photo album again. The one that had been quietly edited to exclude me. I looked through every page. Every missing photo. Every face turned just slightly away. There was one photo left of me in uniform, but even that had been flipped backward in its sleeve. I didn't turn it around. I didn't need to. As I sat there, the sliding door behind me creaked open. Karen's voice floated in. "Looking for something?" she asked quietly. I turned to face her. "Just reminding myself I exist," I said. She hesitated, like there was more she wanted to say, but didn't know how. Then she walked away, whispering almost to herself, "You always did make things complicated." That stuck with me. No one ever said that about Brian. Brian made everything easy, predictable, safe. That's why they chose him. Later, as I passed by the dining room on my way back to the guest room, one of the women from earlier, the same one who'd whispered about me, caught my arm gently. I didn't recognize her name, but I knew the face. One of Brian's church friends. She leaned in, her voice coated in honey and pity. "I heard Brian had to support your mother all alone for years," she whispered. Bless his heart. I didn't respond. Not then. There was no point in arguing with a script that had already been written without me. But that was the moment I knew what I had to do. I walked straight back to the cabinet, opened it again, pulled out the deed, held it in my hands, and looked around the house they claimed I had no part in, the house they said I had abandoned, the house they were using to build their fiction. They called me a freeloader, a burden, a broken soldier. But I paid for this place. With deployment checks, with sleepless nights, with silence I carried like a wound. And now, it was time to remind them who it really belonged to. Dinner the next evening felt more like a performance than a meal. The house was perfectly staged, as if a magazine crew might walk in at any moment. Brian had outdone himself, again. The long oak dining table gleamed under dimmed chandelier light. Crystal glasses, borrowed china, and Karen's antique silver were arranged with almost surgical precision. Every seat was filled. Every guest played their role. They smiled, nodded, sipped, complimented the food. Laughter floated over the table like fog, shallow, decorative, masking something sour beneath it. I sat at the far end, mostly hidden behind a potted fern and the strategic placement of a dessert tray. I thought maybe I could blend in, maybe they'd forget I was there. But Brian had other plans. Just before anyone picked up their forks, he stood and raised his glass, pausing dramatically. "Before we dig in," he said, "I think it's only appropriate we have a blessing." Then he turned toward me with a smirk sharp enough to slice glass. "Rachel, since you've come all this way and seen so much, would you do the honors?" The room fell silent. Forks froze midair. Someone coughed softly. I could hear the hum of the ceiling fan, the tick of Karen's antique clock in the hall. He was daring me, not to offer a prayer, but to perform, to be a spectacle. The ghost at the table offering words of grace. I set down my water, folded my hands in front of me like a prop, and said, "Sure." My voice was calm, even. "Let's talk about sacrifice." Chairs creaked. Eyes turned to me, some curious, some suddenly very cautious. "Bless this food," I began slowly, "and those who prepared it. Bless those we've lost, especially the ones who gave everything they had, only to be remembered with awkward toasts and misplaced credit." I saw Brian's smile twitch at the corner. I didn't stop. And bless the silence, the kind that lets injustice fester quietly until it begins to rot the house it lives in. Across the table, Karen flinched. Aunt Debbie coughed into her wine glass. "Thank you." Brian cut in quickly, forcing a laugh. That was heartfelt. He turned to the room again, smiling wide. "Some serve, some return broken. But what matters is that we all return." A pause. Then scattered laughter. Uncomfortable, but no one challenged it. Not out loud. It was the kind of line you couldn't question without looking heartless. I scanned the room. Uncle Dave, red-faced from too much wine, muttered something about the house still standing. "And Rachel's here," Aunt Debbie added with a strained smile. "That's a miracle in itself." At the far end, someone whispered, "She doesn't even pay rent." I heard it. They thought I didn't. They always underestimated what I heard. I didn't react. I didn't speak, but I remembered every single face that looked away when I lifted my eyes. Every forced grin. Every nod that came half a second too late. They weren't just talking about me, they were rewriting me, turning me into someone they could mock, guilt-free. A failed soldier. An unstable daughter. A burden. Karen wouldn't meet my gaze. She sat stiffly in her chair, her hands curled in her lap like she was trying to fold into herself. Brian looked proud, like he had just delivered a final punchline. Then the doorbell rang. He frowned. "Who's that?" I thought everyone was already. "I'll get it," I said, standing before anyone else could move. I walked down the hallway, heart steady, breath even. When I opened the door, there he was, Connor Blake. He stood casually on the porch, one hand in his coat pocket, the other holding a bottle of cheap red wine. His hair was still short, military style, but everything else about him had softened. He smiled, wide and sure, like he already knew what kind of storm he had walked into. "Wrong address?" I asked dryly. "Nope," he said, grinning. "Your brother texted me the invite. Said he was being inclusive. But I figured you'd need a buffer." Footsteps echoed behind me. Brian appeared, his expression shifting from surprise to irritation. "Connor," he said, voice clipped. "How unexpected." Connor lifted the bottle slightly. Cabernet. Wasn't sure what paired well with tension and betrayal. Karen was next to arrive. She forced a smile. "Connor, you remember Rachel's cousin?" He tilted his head slightly and said, "Oh, I remember exactly who everyone is." Back in the dining room, Brian scrambled to reclaim control. He introduced Connor to the few guests who didn't already remember him from holidays and barbecues long past. "Connor's an old family friend," he said. "He just happened to be in the area." I let him lie. Connor sat next to me, without asking. The rest of the dinner passed in stiff smiles and fake laughter. I barely touched my food. I didn't need to. I was listening. Every lie they told. Every carefully worded spin. I let them have their theater. Let them believe I hadn't noticed. Then came the final toast. Brian stood again, holding up his glass. His eyes sparkled as he looked directly at me. "To family," he said, "those who stay useful and sane." The pause afterward wasn't long, but it was enough. A deliberate jab. Polished, theatrical, cruel. The kind of insult that would be brushed off as a joke later. But I didn't blink. Connor leaned in, his voice low, just for me. "You still have the deed, right? You could fight this." I nodded slightly. "I know. Then why aren't you?" The words hung in the air like fog, thick, heavy, waiting. After the guests left and the dishes were stacked, I sat on the porch steps. The wood was cold beneath me. Connor leaned against the railing beside me, a can of beer sweating in his hand. The backyard stretched behind us into darkness. Somewhere beyond the fence, the neighbor's motion light flicked on. Inside the house, more voices murmured, planning tomorrow's memorial. The celebration. The performance. Connor watched me in silence for a long time. Then he said, "I've seen what you're capable of. This isn't you, isn't it?" I asked, my voice flat. "Letting them rewrite everything. Letting them erase it. That's not forgetting," he said. "That's theft." I stared into the dark. Before I left for my last deployment, I said, "Dad made me promise not to let the house go." He was worried.
About Mom.
About Brian. He said they'd find a way to twist things. Connor straightened slightly. "Did he leave anything?" "He wrote a second will. A sealed one. Said it would show up if anything went sideways. But I never saw it." "You check with a lawyer?" I shook my head. "I asked Mom once. She said it was all settled. That Dad didn't leave loose ends." Connor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I checked the county record before I came. Thought it was odd your name was still listed as the primary owner." I turned my head toward him, alert. "Still?" He nodded. "Brian tried to file for a transfer last year. Got denied. The clerk flagged the title. It was never revoked. You're still the sole holder." The beer in my hand suddenly felt warm. "She told everyone I signed it over," I whispered.
She lied.
Or she tried to force it and hope no one would look. My chest tightened. But it wasn't panic. It wasn't rage. It was sharper. More focused. Like the click of a safety switch being flipped before a rifle fires. I made Brian a temporary cosigner before I left. Just to pay property taxes and utilities. Power of attorney. Nothing more. Connor looked at me seriously. Then you still have it. The house. The leverage. From the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a shift in the curtain. A figure. Watching. Brian's watching, I muttered. Connor followed my gaze. If you don't act now, he'll find another way. They always do. The wind pushed against my back like a hand. I stood slowly, brushed off my jeans, and walked back inside. The silence was no longer passive. It had become a weapon. The house was still buzzing the next morning, filled with low voices, clinking coffee mugs, and the faint sound of a vacuum running somewhere down the hall. It was the day of the memorial, or as Brian called it, Dad's celebration of legacy. But legacy, I had come to learn, meant whatever story you could sell to a room full of people who wanted to believe you. I stood in the kitchen with a fresh pot of coffee brewing. The scent filled the air, but it didn't feel warm. It felt artificial, like everything else in the house since I returned. Karen entered slowly, her robe drawn tight, holding a chipped mug I hadn't seen in years. One of the old ones from my childhood, glazed yellow with a crack running down the side. She didn't speak at first, just moved like a ghost, performing the motions of motherhood she no longer understood. I didn't know you still drank coffee, she finally said, her voice soft but cautious. I never stopped, I replied, not looking at her. She leaned against the counter, staring at her mug like it might say something for her. You've always been good at hiding things, she murmured. Not always, I said. Some things were just ignored. Karen didn't argue with that. Her fingers drummed the ceramic. She hesitated again, then asked, Are you okay? I turned to face her, setting down my cup. I will be, after today. She nodded slowly, like she was agreeing to something she hadn't fully heard. Connor entered then, holding a plain manila envelope. He didn't say much, just placed the folder on the counter with quiet finality. Everything's printed, he said. Ownership title, power of attorney, history, and your dad's sealed will. All notarized. I nodded. Put the originals in the old study. Top drawer. The oak one Dad used to keep locked. Connor glanced toward the hall. Think Brian will look? No, I said. He'll be too busy getting ready for his speech. He gave me a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. We moved like clockwork, two people used to precision, used to pressure. He handled the paperwork. I handled the house. I poured coffee for both of us, while the printer downstairs hummed the last of the legal documents. The sound made my pulse feel steadier. Karen had left the room by the time I turned back toward the sink. Outside the kitchen window, the backyard was freshly manicured. Every bush trimmed. Every flower bed arranged. Brian had made sure everything was photo-ready. Because that was what this was, an event, not a memorial. A tribute to himself, more than our father. Connor disappeared to the study. When he returned, I was still standing at the window, coffee forgotten, watching as folding chairs were set up in the garden like props on a set. She's going to make an announcement, Connor said, referring to Brian. I didn't respond. He added, You prepped the affidavit? In the basement. Mick's down there too. We moved downstairs, to the only room in the house that still felt untouched by the new version of the story Brian had tried to write. The old smell of dust and wood polish clung to the walls like memory. I sat in the chair Dad used to read in. It creaked just like it always had. Connor positioned the tripod, adjusted the mic, checked the audio levels. Then he nodded. I took a breath. This is Rachel Moore, I said. This statement is to clarify ownership of the Moore property, filed originally under my name and never legally transferred. The words came out like iron, measured, heavy, final. I didn't rush. I didn't stumble. I spoke like someone who had waited 10 years to be heard. Connor monitored everything, his eyes flicking between me and the recorder. When I finished, he gave a short nod. It's airtight. I stood and brushed my palms on my jeans, but they weren't shaking. Later, as I came back upstairs, I saw a familiar figure standing in the foyer, duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Liam, our cousin. We hadn't seen each other in years. He lived in Oregon now, distant by miles and time. Rachel, he said, surprised. Didn't know you were already here. Got in a few days ago. He looked at me, not with pity, but with something deeper. A quiet understanding. You okay? I nodded once. Working on it. He dropped his bag beside the coat rack. Well, if you need anything, sometimes people forget how much quiet hurts. I looked at him for a long moment and said, I'll remember that. Before I could say more, Brian descended the staircase like a politician preparing for a press conference. His hair perfect. His suit sharper than necessary. There you are, he said, eyes scanning the hallway but locking on mine. I hope you're ready for today. It's going to be unforgettable. I smiled at him. The same smile I used in Afghanistan when someone tried to corner me in a lie. I'm counting on it, I said. He gave a laugh, all teeth and no warmth, and turned toward a group arriving through the side door. Connor passed by, placing his phone in my palm without a word. I unlocked it. A message waited on the screen. It's done. She won't see it coming. I slipped it into my pocket and stood up straighter. The show was about to begin. The house was still buzzing the next morning, filled with low voices, clinking coffee mugs, and the faint sound of a vacuum running somewhere down the hall. It was the day of the memorial, or as Brian called it, Dad's celebration of legacy. But legacy, I had come to learn, meant whatever story you could sell to a room full of people who wanted to believe you. I stood in the kitchen with a fresh pot of coffee brewing. The scent filled the air, but it didn't feel warm. It felt artificial, like everything else in the house since I returned. Karen entered slowly, her robe drawn tight, holding a chipped mug I hadn't seen in years. One of the old ones from my childhood, glazed yellow, with a crack running down the side. She didn't speak at first. Just moved like a ghost, performing the motions of motherhood she no longer understood. I didn't know you still drank coffee, she finally said, her voice soft but cautious. I never stopped, I replied, not looking at her. She leaned against the counter, staring at her mug like it might say something for her. You've always been good at hiding things, she murmured. Not always, I said. Some things were just ignored. Karen didn't argue with that. Her fingers drummed the ceramic. She hesitated again, then asked, Are you okay? I turned to face her, setting down my cup. I will be, after today. She nodded slowly, like she was agreeing to something she hadn't fully heard. Connor entered then, holding a plain manila envelope. He didn't say much, just placed the folder on the counter with quiet finality. Everything's printed, he said. Ownership title. Power of attorney. History. And your dad's sealed will. All notarized. I nodded. Put the originals in the old study. Top drawer. The oak one Dad used to keep locked. Connor glanced toward the hall. Think Brian will look? No, I said. He'll be too busy getting ready for his speech. He gave me a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. We moved like clockwork, two people used to precision, used to pressure. He handled the paperwork. I handled the house. I poured coffee for both of us, while the printer downstairs hummed the last of the legal documents. The sound made my pulse feel steadier. Karen had left the room by the time I turned back toward the sink. Outside the kitchen window, the backyard was freshly manicured. Every bush trimmed. Every flower bed arranged. Brian had made sure everything was photo-ready. Because that was what this was, an event, not a memorial. A tribute to himself, more than our father. Connor disappeared to the study. When he returned, I was still standing at the window, coffee forgotten, watching as folding chairs were set up in the garden like props on a set. She's going to make an announcement, Connor said, referring to Brian. I didn't respond. He added, You prepped the affidavit? In the basement. Mick's down there too. We moved downstairs, to the only room in the house that still felt untouched by the new version of the story Brian had tried to write. The old smell of dust and wood polish clung to the walls like memory. I sat in the chair Dad used to read in. It creaked just like it always had. Connor positioned the tripod, adjusted the mic, checked the audio levels. Then he nodded. I took a breath. "This is Rachel Moore," I said. "This statement is to clarify ownership of the Moore property, filed originally under my name and never legally transferred." The words came out like iron, measured, heavy, final. I didn't rush. I didn't stumble. I spoke like someone who had waited 10 years to be heard. Connor monitored everything, his eyes flicking between me and the recorder. When I finished, he gave a short nod. "It's airtight." I stood and brushed my palms on my jeans, but they weren't shaking. Later, as I came back upstairs, I saw a familiar figure standing in the foyer, duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Liam, our cousin. We hadn't seen each other in years. He lived in Oregon now, distant by miles and time. "Rachel," he said, surprised. "Didn't know you were already here. Got in a few days ago." He looked at me, not with pity, but with something deeper. A quiet understanding. "You okay?" I nodded once. "Working on it." He dropped his bag beside the coat rack. "Well, if you need anything, sometimes people forget how much quiet hurts." I looked at him for a long moment and said, "I'll remember that." Before I could say more, Brian descended the staircase like a politician preparing for a press conference. His hair perfect, his suit sharper than necessary. "There you are," he said, eyes scanning the hallway but locking on mine. "I hope you're ready for today. It's going to be unforgettable." I smiled at him. The same smile I used in Afghanistan when someone tried to corner me in a lie. "I'm counting on it," I said. He gave a laugh, all teeth and no warmth, and turned toward a group arriving through the side door. Connor passed by, placing his phone in my palm without a word. I unlocked it. A message waited on the screen. "It's done. She won't see it coming." I slipped it into my pocket and stood up straighter. The show was about to begin. The house looked like a showroom for grief. Candles flickered on every surface, casting a soft golden light over walls carefully lined with framed photos of my father, each one handpicked, arranged with intention. None of them included me. Soft instrumental music floated from hidden speakers, polite and inoffensive. Even the floral arrangements in the hallway had been coordinated to match Brian's press suit. I stood near the hallway entrance, dressed in black, hands loosely wrapped around a glass of wine I didn't intend to drink. The fabric of my dress felt heavy on my skin, not with sorrow, but with purpose. I wasn't here to mourn. I was here to end something. Connor leaned beside the fireplace, casual on the surface, sharp underneath. Liam stayed by the front entrance, nodding to guests as they arrived. His eyes kept finding mine, like a silent check-in. "Are you still steady?" I was. I had never been steadier. Karen sat off to the side in an upholstered armchair, her makeup too dark for the hour, her face pale and brittle. The room buzzed with controlled energy. Glasses clinked, voices whispered, the air thick with curated nostalgia. This wasn't the memorial. It was a stage. Then Brian appeared near the mantel, his posture confident, his tone just loud enough to hush the room. He cleared his throat and took his place beneath the large photo of Dad in uniform. "Thank you all for coming," he said, voice velvet smooth. "Dad would have loved this. The garden, the company, the strength of family." A few nods. A few polite sighs. I stayed silent. "I know not everyone could be here for the hard years," Brian continued, voice rising theatrically. "But that's okay. We, those who stayed, carried him through to the end." A wave of murmured agreement followed. I felt the weight of their eyes shift toward me, subtle but unmistakable. A message. We were here. You weren't. And especially Mom, Brian added, taking Karen's hand like he was guiding her through a royal ceremony. She gave everything to keep this home standing. And now, she's passing it on to me. The words floated into the room like perfume laced with poison. She's trusted me to carry on the Moore name, to ensure this house stays in the right hands. Gasps rose, soft, planned, perfectly timed. This was Brian's moment. His coronation. Connor moved then. Without saying a word, he walked to the buffet table and pressed a button on the tripod camera, activating the live stream Brian had set up himself for out-of-town friends. The red recording light flicked on. Connor walked directly to me, placed a sealed folder in my hands, and stepped back. I looked around the room, let the silence linger just long enough for it to grow uncomfortable. Then I stepped forward. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. It was never transferred. I said calmly. You've just been squatting. The room shifted. The words landed like glass against tile. A pause. Stunned silence. Then a wave of hushed disbelief rolled across the room. What? Someone said. I'm sorry. What does she mean? I held up the folder and slowly opened it. Inside, notarized documentation. The original deed with my name, the power of attorney form, the sealed will from my father, and Connor's affidavit verifying everything. At the top of the page, in bold letters, ownership status, 100% Rachel Moore. This house was never signed over, I said. No agreement was made. No transfer processed. You've been lying. To everyone. Brian stepped forward, jaw tight. I don't know what you're talking about. Karen rose, her voice tight. That's not how we see it. I turned to her slowly. Truth doesn't care about your perspective. The room froze again. This time, it wasn't just confusion. It was fear. People started whispering. I caught the words legal title, notarized, documented. Some of them reached for their phones. Brian's face turned red. You're making a scene, he snapped under his breath. Connor stepped beside me. Calm. Still. Silent. Karen sank back into her chair. Not in acceptance, but in defeat. Like her knees had finally buckled under the weight of her complicity. Brian stepped closer to me, lowering his voice so only I could hear. You're going to regret this. I smiled. Not today. Some people build walls. I file paperwork. The next morning, the sky was the color of wet ash, dull, gray, and stripped of illusion. I liked it that way. A day without pretense. I parked 2 blocks from the Fairfax County Land Records office, pulled my coat tighter around me, and walked the rest of the way. My boots hit the pavement with measured certainty. No hesitation. No doubt. Just the rhythm of a woman who had already won. Inside, the office smelled like aging paper and coffee that had been left too long on the burner. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. I approached the front desk where a woman with square glasses and a chipped blue name tag, Miss Kent, looked up from her computer. I need to verify a property title, I said. Rachel Moore, 143, West Haven Court. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. Within seconds, she frowned slightly and said, That one's definitely in your name. Has been since 2012. No liens. No amendments. I nodded. I need a certified, stamped copy. She glanced at me curiously, not challenging, just intrigued. Is there a specific reason? I didn't answer. It wasn't required. From the far corner of the room, I noticed Liam, leaning casually against the wall, pretending to read a poster on public records access. He hadn't told me he'd follow. He just showed up, quiet support in a world that never offered it freely. Ms. Kent returned with a folder, sealed and marked. Here's the ownership certificate, she said. Stamped, dated. It shows every recorded action, or, in your case, the lack of one. I scanned the top line. Clear and clean. My name, Rachel Marie Moore. Liam stepped beside me. You should scan it. Upload the backup. I nodded, slid Connor's USB into the public terminal, and began scanning every document. Ownership records, power of attorney, the sealed will, Connor's affidavit, and the previous day's notarized video statement. One set went to my email, another to a private cloud Connor had created during law school. Then Ms. Kent returned with something else. There's one more document, she said. Unusual request. A failed title claim from 2017. Someone tried to declare you military MIA to claim property transfer. It was denied immediately. My stomach clenched, not with surprise, but with confirmation. Who filed it? I asked. She hesitated, then slid a redacted copy across the counter. One line was bolded near the top. Claimant, Brian Moore. Reason, MIA transfer request. Status, denied. He had tried to have me declared missing. Disappeared. So he could take everything. Liam read it with me, his jaw locking. I didn't flinch. I asked for a certified copy of the rejection, scanned that too, and closed the file. That night, the house was quiet. No guests. No music. No staged lighting. Just me, Connor, Liam, and the truth. The people Brian had called trusted family had vanished faster than sympathy at a foreclosure notice. The living room was still, the fireplace cold. Connor laid out the documents on the coffee table. Brian sat across from me, trying to act composed, but his hands kept twitching. It's all just a misunderstanding, he said, forcing a calm voice. The paperwork's outdated. We've been meaning to clear it up ever since Rachel returned. Outdated? I repeated. Like my service? My voice? My name? Connor opened the folder. This is the deed, he said. Ownership, Rachel Moore. No amendments. No legal filings. No authorized transfer. He tapped the power of attorney line. No changes without the written consent of the legal owner. Karen said nothing, just stared at her hands. Brian scoffed. Anyone can print a PDF. This doesn't prove anything except her obsession with the past. I raised an eyebrow. Would you like to explain the 2017 MIA claim you filed? His mouth opened, then closed. That was Mom's idea, he snapped. She thought you were gone. You weren't writing, you weren't calling. We thought you. They knew where I was, I said coldly. The military knew. You knew. Connor pulled out another paper. Here's the rejection notice. Official. And here, he held up the printed email, is a copy of your message to a neighbor in 2020. You wrote, Rachel gave up the house. She's never coming back. I stood slowly. Mrs. Sanders? I called. From the hallway, Mrs. Sanders, our old neighbor in her lavender coat and orthopedic shoes, stepped forward. Her voice didn't shake. He told me she had left the family, that she had walked away. He told me that more than once. The silence that followed wasn't surprised. It was stunned. Brian tried to recover. This is ridiculous. I've been taking care of Mom, the house, everything, while she was off playing hero or ghost or whatever. You told us Rachel donated the house, said Aunt Debbie, her smile gone. You said it was in a trust, added Uncle Dave, confused and frowning. I never said that, Brian hissed. Connor was done playing nice. We have the emails. And audio. Would you prefer we share those? Brian turned to Karen.
Mom.
Say something. Karen looked up at me for the first time. Truly looked. Then lowered her gaze and said nothing. It was enough. I stepped forward and picked up the deed. This house is mine, I said, steady and clear. You used it. You tried to steal it. And now you will leave. Brian stared at me, his nostrils flared. His voice cracked as he growled. You want war. I didn't blink. You already started it. The next day, the moving truck arrived at exactly 3 p.m. The house stood silent, cold light pouring through the windows. Connor was waiting in the hallway, clipboard in hand. The movers were polite, professional, and prepared. Brian hadn't packed a thing. He came storming down the stairs, hair uncombed, eyes wild. What the hell is this? You think you can just throw me out? Connor handed me the notarized confirmation. I placed it gently on the table. You had 14 days, I said. They're over. Brian spun toward Connor. Is this even legal? You were served, Connor said plainly. You didn't contest. You forfeited by silence. The movers waited. One of them said, You're welcome to supervise the packing, sir. Brian laughed bitterly. Unbelievable. You're actually doing this. I stepped toward him, calm, quiet, firm. You chose this. When you lied. When you told people I was gone. When you tried to erase me. His voice broke. You're heartless. No, I said softly. You had my heart. And you burned it. He froze, the words cracking something inside him. But not enough. He stormed upstairs, slammed the door. An hour later, he walked out wearing sunglasses, dragging 2 overstuffed bags. At the front door, he paused.
Fine, he spat. You win.
But you'll be alone in this damn house. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The truck pulled away. The silence that returned wasn't hollow anymore. It was clean. Cleansing. It was mine. Later, I opened the safe in the study, the one that had held more than just legal forms. Inside was my father's final letter. His handwriting was sharp, deliberate. You've always been the strong one. This house is yours. Not because of blood, but because legacy belongs to those who protect it. I refolded the letter with quiet reverence and locked it away again. Connor returned with final documents. Everything signed. Irrevocable. He handed me one last page, a simple agreement. If Brian signs this acknowledgement of false claims, he walks away clean. If not, you sue. I looked at Liam. He nodded. You still want peace? Yes, I said. But not silence. The next day, I walked through the house barefoot, every step echoing as if the walls were finally listening. The yoga mats were gone. The peppermint candles. The fake affirmations. In their place, I taped up new sketches, real ones. Floor plans for refinishing the study. Building a reading nook. Creating something that wasn't just mine in name, but in purpose. A letter arrived later that week. No return address. I recognized the handwriting, Karen's. I opened it, read the first few lines. I don't ask for forgiveness. But I know I was wrong. Silence was my shield. And my weapon. I'm sorry. I folded it quietly. Walked to the fireplace. Lit a match. Watched it turn to ash. Not out of anger, but because I no longer needed her apology to be whole. I was never broken. Just erased. Now, I had returned.